Hey there, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are tackling one of the absolute most powerful and honestly most controversial concepts in constitutional law, judicial review. It's essentially the ultimate tug of war between the lawmakers who write the rules and the judges who enforce them. We're going to compare how this massive power plays out in the United States versus how it works over in India. And hey, if you have zero legal background, do not sweat it. We are building this right from the ground floor. Let's jump in.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the power of judicial review itself, then look at the unwritten American model, followed by the express Indian model. After that, we'll cover institutional restraint in America, textual carve-outs in India, and wrap it all up with a structured lesson recap. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the power of judicial review, and how it actually binds the government.
If you only remember one thing today, make it this. Judicial review is the mechanism that turns a constitution from a mere document into a binding, enforceable limit on government. Seriously, without it, a constitution is really just a piece of paper with some good intentions. But with it, it becomes the supreme law.
Think about it like a referee and a basketball game, right? The players are the politicians passing laws, and the rule book is the Constitution. If a player blatantly breaks a rule, the referee blows the whistle and completely nullifies the play. While in legal terms, judicial review is defined as the power of courts to examine the constitutionality of legislative enactments and executive action, and to strike down what conflicts with the Constitution.
Moving on to Section 2, the unwritten American model. We're looking at an implied power here. Now, to really grasp this, we have to travel back to 1803 for a case called Marbury v. Madison. And the facts here are pure political drama. The outgoing presidential administration was frantically appointing these midnight judges at the absolute last minute before losing power. But the new incoming administration just flat out refused to deliver the official paper commissions. So a man named William Marbury sued to get his job. But the core legal issue the Supreme Court had to resolve was way bigger than just one guy's job. Do the courts have the inherent power to void a legislative statute that conflicts with the Constitution? Well, the court's answer was a resounding yes. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote this incredibly famous line, stating, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is." And Marshall's logic? It was actually brilliant in its simplicity. He reasoned that because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it's explicitly the judiciary's job to interpret and apply the law, well, the courts must therefore have the power to void any normal law that conflicts with that supreme one. That single holding basically planted a massive seed. It established the American model of implied judicial review. And notice I say implied, because it was born out of pure judicial interpretation, not explicit constitutional text. While early U.S. courts used this power pretty sparingly, it has grown over time into a massive oak tree, expanding significantly during the New Deal and civil rights eras to actually strike down laws that violate the Constitution. So, how does the U.S. actually apply this power today? Well, imagine an entire league of umpires spread out on a baseball field. Any umpire, anywhere on that field, can call a foul ball, but they can't blow the whistle on some hypothetical play that hasn't even happened yet. Legally, we call this a diffuse system, meaning any court, from the lowest trial court all the way up, can rule on constitutionality. And secondly, it requires concrete review. That means review only arises in an actual, real-world case or controversy. U.S. courts absolutely do not issue hypothetical advisory opinions. All right, let's pivot to Section 3, the express Indian model, where things are actually written into the text. You see, India observed the American experience and decided to leave absolutely nothing to implication. They wrote judicial review directly into their constitution. Let's look at the key provisions. Article 13 explicitly states that any law inconsistent with fundamental rights is void. Then you have Article 32, which grants the right to directly approach the Supreme Court to enforce these rights. In fact, Dr. Ambedkar famously called this the heart and soul of the Constitution. Article 226 gives high courts an even wider writ jurisdiction, and crucially, this is a big contrast to the U.S. Article 143 explicitly permits advisory opinions when the president asks the Supreme Court a question. And that brings us to a really fascinating, uniquely Indian legal concept. Think of a constitution like a house. The legislature definitely has the power to remodel. They can repaint the walls, maybe change out the furniture, but they absolutely cannot dynamite the very foundation of the house itself. In Indian law, this foundation is called the Basic Structure Doctrine. The precise definition is the principle that certain core features of the Constitution, specifically including judicial review, are completely unamendable, even by Parliament.
To see this play out in the real world, we need to look at two pivotal cases together: Minerva Mills from 1980 and L. Chandrakumar from 1997. The facts here are pretty dramatic. The Indian Parliament actually passed constitutional amendments that specifically attempted to exclude the courts from reviewing constitutional amendments and certain administrative tribunals. So the profound constitutional issue here was this: can the legislature utilize its supreme amendment power to oust the judiciary's review power entirely? The Indian Supreme Court's holding was a definitive hard no. They struck down those legislative exclusions. So the crucial takeaway here is that the Indian Supreme Court firmly held that judicial review under Articles 32 and 226 is an unamendable part of the basic structure. Simply put, Parliament cannot delete the court's power to review laws under any circumstances whatsoever. Okay, moving to Section 4, Institutional Restraint in America, and choosing not to intervene. So, because the U.S. Constitution doesn't list any actual written exceptions to judicial review, American courts actively choose to restrain themselves. They step back. First, there's the doctrine of standing, meaning a plaintiff needs a concrete, actual injury to even bring a lawsuit. Again, no hypothetical advisory opinions. Second is the presumption of constitutionality. Courts generally just assume a law is valid and defer to legislative judgment unless there's a very clear violation. These are purely self-imposed institutional choices. The ultimate example of this American self-restraint is a 1962 case called Baker v. Carr. The facts involved political map drawing, specifically state legislative apportionment disputes trying to enter the courts. The holding in this case famously established the political question doctrine, and its significance is huge. It dictates that courts will formally decline to hear matters that the Constitution explicitly commits to another branch of government, like foreign affairs. The court basically recognizes its own limits and just draws a line it won't cross. Now for Section 5, Textual Carve-outs in India. Let's look at written exceptions and the resulting judicial pushback. In direct contrast to America's self-imposed limits, India's limitations are explicit shields written directly into the constitutional text. For example, Article 31C shields specific government policy goals known as directive principles from being challenged on fundamental rights grounds. Articles 122 and 212 bar courts from questioning parliamentary procedures over mere irregularities. Article 361 grants executive immunity for the president and governors, and Article 74(2) stops courts from inquiring into the advice ministers give to the president. But, without a doubt, the most controversial textual carve-out was the Ninth Schedule. Let's trace this vital timeline to see the steady story of Indian courts pushing back against blanket legislative immunity. Back in 1951, the Ninth Schedule was created, and basically any law placed in this schedule was totally immune from judicial review regarding fundamental rights. Then, jumping to April 24, 1973, the landmark Keshavananda judgment established the basic structure doctrine we talked about. Finally, in 2007, the Supreme Court really had to reevaluate this total immunity. And that leads us to our final major case, I.R. Coelho v. State of Tamil Nadu in 2007. Decided by a massive 9-judge bench, the facts were that the government was continuously just placing laws into the Ninth Schedule specifically to shield them from fundamental rights review. It had basically become a giant constitutional loophole. So the critical issue for the court was, does this blanket legislative immunity violate the core basic structure of the Constitution? The court's holding drew a massive hard line in the sand. They ruled that laws placed in the Ninth Schedule after April 24, 1973, which, remember, is the exact date the basic structure doctrine was born, are indeed reviewable by courts if they damage that basic structure or core fundamental rights. The significance here is profound. The court massively narrowed the textual exception, ensuring that the basic structure doctrine reigns supreme over any legislative carve-outs. Finally, Section 6, Structured Lesson Recap. Let's review the core concepts. Okay, let's carefully recap every core doctrine and case we covered today so you can really lock this all into memory. First, judicial review itself. It's about enforceable limits on government, using diffuse and concrete review in the U.S. Second, the U.S. model. It's an implied power birthed by Marbury v. Madison. Third, U.S. restraints. These are institutional choices, like the political question doctrine from Baker v. Carr. Fourth, the Indian model. It uses express constitutional text, like Articles 13, 32, 143, and 226. Fifth, the Indian doctrine, the unamendable basic structure cemented by Minerva Mills and L. Chandrakumar. And finally, Indian restraints, textual carve-outs that were ultimately narrowed by I.R. Coelho.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. When a nation's foundational laws are tested, which approach, the unwritten, self-imposed restraint of the American empire or the explicit textual fortress of the Indian basic structure, do you believe better protects the future of a democracy? Something to think about. Thanks so much for learning with me today.